The shift to remote and hybrid work over the past 2 years has accelerated application development on cloud infrastructure. However, securing these new assets has lagged behind. Qualys Cloud View, the next-generation cloud security posture management, delivers an end-to-end multi-cloud security and compliance solution encompassing the entire application lifecycle from build to runtime. Cloud View enables enterprises to assess their cloud security and compliance posture, identify risks and gaps, auto-remediate issues, proactively enforce best practices, improve compliance and audits rapidly and efficiently. Identify your most vulnerable cloud assets by visiting securityweekly.com/Qualys. Securing the modern enterprise requires insights into massive amounts of data. NVIDIA Morpheus harnesses the power of AI and GPU computing to help protect networks in a way never before possible, enabling 100% data visibility to provide cybersecurity analysts the tools to identify, capture, and act on threats and anomalies. Sign up for a free 1-hour NVIDIA Deep Learning Institute course. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/NVIDIA. We know that many of you are looking to bolster your security posture with cloud-native app protection and XDR. So if you haven't heard of Uptycs, put them on your radar. They offer both cloud and endpoint security in a single solution. Listeners can get Uptycs for up to 1,000 assets for a full year for only $1. But hurry, this offer is only available through December 31st at securityweekly.com/Uptycs. That's UPTYCS. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Aviv Graffi from Votiro about making file types secure so users can open any file they need and carry on with their work. And I'm carrying on as Mike Shima, your host. I'm here with John Kinsella and Paul Asadorian, and it's just about time for the news. But first, join our Discord channel to chat with our hosts like us, ask questions, customize live stream alerts, and more. Visit securityweekly.com/Discord to receive an invite. And gentlemen, since this is the episode 222, we will now have a quiz on transforming numbers in 2's complement. So who wishes to start with big endian or little endian? So while you're thinking about that answer, Paul, we've got an article that just dropped today from Eclipsium that is pretty interesting because it's talking about supply chain, okay, yes, but it's talking about a supply chain at a little bit lower level. And Teaser has a really fun exploit payload in it. But I got to turn it over to you. I can't steal all the thunder here.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mike. This is research we've been looking at for some time at Eclipsium, so it's nice to see it public. It's nice to be able to talk about it now publicly. As you know, it's been under embargo, as of course we did, responsible disclosure with the vendor in this case, who happens to be AMI. And it's interesting, I learned a couple of things from this research, such as, and I actually had the researchers in our team put information about Redfish. So Redfish is the protocol, essentially, that is replacing IPMI. So it's the protocol that allows you or applications to interact with the BMC. So because we should also back up, right? The baseband management controller, it's essentially like a computer inside your computer that allows people to manage and administer the server. What I always find interesting about BMC controllers is their level of privilege on the actual hardware is independent of the operating system, and even within the hardware itself, very highly privileged. Because if you think about it, an administrator is going to connect to this system over API or a web interface and rebuild the server remotely. Well, in order to do that, it has to have access to all of that hardware. So that's why, like in the context of how, where this vulnerability is, and also the capabilities that it has, is kind of concerning, right? Because it's a really high level of privilege. So,
yeah.
Go ahead, Mike.
No, I was going to say, yeah, and this is that population of admins, whether you have your own data center or you're relying on someone else's data center. The classic, the cloud is someone else's, but it's made there for you. So tell us some of the what are these vulnerabilities, because they're pretty fun.
Yeah, so there's 3 that are disclosed currently. I will say you can read into that what you will. So the 3 are arbitrary code execution via the API, And we've seen this before. It's typically a web interface or API that is exposed so you can interact with the BMC. That code, as I'm sure you guys talk about every week, typically has some vulnerabilities in it. This one is, it's essentially command injection, right? Inside of that allows an attacker to pull down code and have it execute with root level privileges, which is also kind of interesting when we talk about these embedded style systems. Everything typically runs as root, and the web interface has to be crammed in a small space. And I think there's a lot of code reuse in a lot of these web interfaces that kind of breeds these vulnerabilities. So part of the supply chain is I need an interface for Redfish. Like there's one or two companies that make one. Well, we'll just license it from them, and that becomes another part of the supply chain that happens once you get a server delivered to your doorstep or a PC or whatever, right? So that was the first one.
Yeah, and that's a fun one because it's all within the URL path. So it's actually a path-based injection where you're delivering the payload rather than the classic parameter, A equals blah, blah, blah. The other fun, it takes me back because looking at it, it's basically a curl pipe into shell, but it's throwing in that old IFS bash variable in there, which I have not seen since the early days of like Perl CGI problems from Rainforest Puppy, something like that. So they only gave you
a lot in embedded too. I've seen a lot of like command injection using the IFS and a lot of embedded stuff too.
Yeah, I think it got a 9.9 CVSS score. I think it should be 10 out of 10 just because it has that IFS variable in there.
Right.
But there's two other ones that aren't maybe quite as exciting, which I realize I'm not setting you up for excitement right there. But walk us through maybe the two other vulns. What should we be worried about there?
Yeah, so there's some default credentials in there. So you look in the Etsy shadow. There's a hash in there that we managed to crack, and which interesting. As I read that, I realize it probably wasn't salted, and we might have found that in a couple different places. And this is common. We see in firmware-based devices as well. We see a backdoor or default password that's set. Those are obviously two separate things, as you guys know. But found one of those. As well as a way to enumerate users, which was the other one that got a 7.5, the ability to enumerate users on the system as well, which then, of course, you can use to do some brute force guessing against other users on the system.
Yeah, but clearly that arbitrary command execution is definitely fun, and especially when it's neat to see this at the low level computer within a computer. I think is the great brief way to describe it as you did. And I want to tie that into two other articles that I grabbed. Speaking of sort of call them platform layer or foundational layer types of vulns. Android had a maybe similar in spirit to not necessarily a computer in a computer, but a leaked platform cert that could allow, I think, a process within a process is fair to say that can execute with the Android OS level privileges. So that was pretty interesting. And I'm not sure if either of you have had to either have an Android phone, but one of the good things is that the responses were rather quick from the OEMs who could use over-the-air updates to basically rotate certs, revoke certs, etc., because the OTA updates relied on a different certificate. So the whole modern application sphere, I say it's pretty close, is the idea of roots of trust. It's all certificates all the way down. So you leak one certificate, bad things can happen, which is my way of trying to get on the Kinsella scale. So John, I'm not sure how much this one worried you this week.
Yeah, you got me head scratching. Because the camera probably didn't catch me when you first said, if we're running Android. No, there's an Apple house.
I run Android. I have a Pixel 7.
But by the way. I know there's Android stuff running in this house. Either on, I think I have it all disconnected, but I occasionally see something show up on my network scan. So there's a TV or something around here somewhere. Mm-hmm. So now I'm like, oh no, where's that? So yeah, it's not the end of the world. It's I don't think it's downloading applications, but still I'm like, okay, I need to go and get a good chokehold on that. I don't know. This stuff happens, right? I think what's going to be interesting here. We've got a few stories today around supply chain type stuff, and I don't know. I don't think it was intentional on our side because I think, yeah, maybe it was slightly. I don't know. Maybe I don't think it was, but that's sort of an interesting pattern here, sort of coming along. We've been all year long. We've been like, oh my god, supply chain, and now we've got like several actual real stories about this type of stuff. So.
Yeah, it's interesting, but I spend a lot of time thinking about supply chain. We're making an expansion into supply chain at Eclipsium, so I've done a lot of independent research to understand the various things around supply chains. What I find interesting is when I start to categorize it, I'm like, all right, you could have a software supply chain issue. Maybe that's software that you write and you've got a library, as you guys probably cover at least one of those a week, right? Or it could have a software supply chain issue with third-party software, like my web browser. I didn't write the code in my web browser, but there's a supply chain issue. You've got the whole firmware and hardware, two independent things, right, in firmware and hardware. And when I get to certificates and keys and or hashes, I'm like, that's almost like a different supply chain. In my argument, and some people will fight me on it, which is fine, but my argument is your response is slightly different. When you have a key, you have to update a revocation list, as an example, which is not the same thing as applying a patch or swapping out a library or something of that nature. So that's why I kind of give it these keys their own category, if you will, inside of supply chain threats or management, because I think your response is different, and you're also very reliant on the upstream vendor, right? I mean, in some cases you can take over the chain of trust yourself, but not all the time. On your Android phone, you probably can, right? And also for secure boot on your PC, you could.
Yeah. Also in there, you need to keep on track of like, okay, there's a cert revoke list, but like, is that being updated, and is anything actually paying attention to it? Unfortunately,
whose job and responsibility is that to update it, right?
Yeah, and that's what's fun too, because SigStore and Salsa, they're very much on provenance and the signing. And what's interesting too is SigStore was saying, well, maybe we don't want to worry so much about the PKI complexity, and can we do this without cert-based signing? So I think they're also cognizant of some of what you're touching on there, Paul, about what some of the dangers are here, as well as, Let's Encrypt, I think, makes it a lot easier to have free, easily manageable certs, so we can have short lifetimes as well. Now, you don't have a short lifetime necessarily for a cert for signing software, but you do for websites. So the cert only needs to live for 3 days, and if the CRL, the cert revocation list is only updated every few days, you might as well just rotate it anyway before you even have to worry about the revocation. So lots of really interesting designs that can come out of more developer-friendly solutions, which there's also a supply chain that I don't think you quite touched on yet, but it does lead into third party in the sense of the cloud. So we have talked about both the cloud in the sense of CVEs for the cloud. In other words, what are the vulns that I should be aware of, as well as what's happening between Wiz and Orca this year in 2022. We have two research groups picking them apart. And guess what, John, Paul, you haven't been able to maybe necessarily see us, all the clouds are following, but this time is Postgres and IBM. And this one is a really fun one. So we saw the path-based command injection with a curl into Bash with that IFS, the input field separator, for those of you who remember all your Bash variables. This one is classic SQL injection, which I really did not expect. A SQL injection to create a super user account that then goes around and does what your team was doing, Paul. Where are some stored credentials? Where's a Etsy shadow or Etsy password file? And then I'm not going to quite say it's a house of cards that falls down, but it feels like that from a security perspective when you start to chain. I think they had 3 or 4 vulnerabilities that the researchers put together to get cross-tenant attack within here.
Yeah, it's interesting to me from the point of view of, we'll talk about Amazon a little bit later here, in reInvent a little later in the show, but some of the news things I've been seeing over the last week or two is IBM's trying to get out of this cloud game. They're like giving more and more of their cloud business to Azure and Amazon, and then partnering with them on the services and moving people to cloud and hybrid and all that type of thing. But how many times have we seen vulnerabilities this year that are related to just Postgres? It's probably Wiz has someone over there who like lives, eats, sleeps, and dreams in PostgreSQL. So more power to you, dude or dudette. It's interesting, right? But it shows you once again. I think the interesting part about this wasn't so much the SQLi. I mean, that's interesting, but that they're running it in Kubernetes. I mean, okay, I guess it's multi-tenant in theory and all that type of thing, but it's one thing to say, it's another thing to actually do it. So I think that was sort of the interesting part of this. My impression from some of the wording in there, my impression is this was part of a pen test. They didn't say that. I don't know if they would say that, but after they found the first, I think the SQLi, they disclosed that and got permission to keep going, which that's usually in my life, you're only given that permission if you had permission in the first place. So interesting. I'm glad to see them helping protect if that's what's going on. But either way, it's a pretty good. It's a good write up. It's funny though. One last thought on it. I'm working on another write up for something I've been sitting on for too long, and I was hoping to have it up for the show today. But part of what I'm stuck doing right now, besides waiting for a CVE ID, is working on the write up. And I'm sort of in the point where we see write-ups like this fairly regularly now. I'm like, now that means I have to actually do a decent write-up when I actually put something out there. And I can't just like do a quick
the bar has been raised.
Yeah, it's the bar high for you. Yeah.
Yeah, and thanks for emphasizing that point too. The in this write-up, it sounded like IBM's monitoring found the shenanigans that the Wiz researchers were doing. So there was a success here of monitoring, and then they reached out and said collaboratively, what are you doing around here? Carry on, but keep us in the loop now. And so it was definitely very much a shared investigation into some of these vulns here. And I wanted to highlight that because that's how the security teams, the engineering teams work together, rather than bringing in the lawyers and comms to start saying that, no, we take our security seriously. Yawn, sigh, let's carry on to something else. But Paul, your vuln about our discussion about Eclipsium, it was web-based into the foundations of the computers within a computer. There's also computers within cars. And I had a quick article that was basically pure web hacking. So we're not going to get some fun CAN bus or microcontroller insights here, but we do have some insights that there are web-based APIs that you can use to basically do something more fancy than pop out the CD tray on computers. You can actually, remotely, control the car based on CRLF injection. So basically line feed injections, which is another vuln I haven't seen before, which is basically a little bit of JWT analysis. Here's a legit JWT. Here's the email we want to target, basically the user ID, and we're going to use this with a couple extra line feeds to confuse the backend web application to say, you wanted this email address, and but here's your JOT. Yep, I'm going to put them together even though the contents don't match, give you back a VIN, and then with the VIN you can take over everything else. So I thought it was just really neat from just the write-up perspective of pure web hacking, relatively simple web hacking, but they say, the researchers, the write-up, they say, they took a little bit of time to fuzz to figure out what does this do, what does this other thing do. So it was that idea of there's patience here that we often hand wave over in a lot of the research that goes on.
It's not just like an authentication, API authentication failure.
It very much is an authentication failure, as well as then call it an information leak, so that you can also get access to the VIN, because one of the authorization. Being a little bit loose with my auth-n versus my auth-z because I'm thinking extemporaneously. But basically saying if you have the correct VIN, then you can honk the horn, remotely stop, start, lock. And so, but you had to have if you didn't know the VIN up front, then you could craft your JOT, submit it with your legitimate email address, your own VIN, but then have the one that looked up the address that you injected. The server would return the VIN that matches with your injected email address. So it was that was the way they could combine a couple steps to take over a car.
They're
crazy.
They've got a quote in there from a SiriusXM spokesman saying that they had this resolved within 24 hours of report, which, presuming that's true, kudos. You know, we usually don't think of the auto industry moving at the speed of light.
True.
So I know Tesla sort of brags about that recently, but hey, it's cool to see others being able to turn around that quickly as well.
Well, I think people use this to steal cars. Is some of the things that I've covered on the past, and I've actually heard recently that in certain geographic areas there's like a huge uptick in stolen cars. And I think it's vulnerabilities like this. There's at least one case I remember maybe a year ago we covered where like it was a direct correlation, and because someone posted a YouTube video on how to do it, people were using it to steal cars.
Yeah.
So their response has to be pretty quick.
Well, you'd think that there was an issue out from we covered about what 6 or 8 weeks
Was
ago.
it Hyundai?
Yeah, I think it's Hyundai.
Yeah.
Where on some of their lower end cars, I believe it's just lower end cars, they don't have they don't depend upon the immobilizer chip in the key. So someone had a TikTok video on that, but Hyundai has been dragging their feet on the mitigation of that and basically getting customers to pay about $1,000 to fix it.
Yeah, because sometimes it's not an over-the-air update.
Yeah.
You got to swap the key fob out.
Yeah, but still, in my mind, automakers should be fixing that. But
Yeah.
Well, there's other things that I was almost had a good segue there. I'll work on that, Johns, because I need a moment to throw over to you to talk about AWS RE:invent IFS pipe bash. No, wait, I'm mixing my streams here. But yes, AWS reInvent. What have they been inventing this year? What's the cloud security look like on the horizon?
I'm going to back up really quickly about 5 minutes and say I forgot to get out on the Wiz write-up. Props on the name Hell's Keychain. We were talking about food off air, so that's a good name that they managed to squeeze that in there. It's,
we called ours BMCNC.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of discussions that happen about how to name things.
Yes.
And I thought Hell's Keychain was really good as well.
Yeah. And for those who aren't aware, Hell's Kitchen is a reality TV show with Gordon Ramsay yelling at chefs and cheap entertainment. Anyways, reInvent was last week, man. For those who are wondering where I was, I spent most of last week glued to YouTube watching remotely videos with down at reInvent, Amazon show in Vegas. The craziness that is. So for this show, what I thought would be sort of fun was I pulled out about 7 videos, my 7 favorite videos. I think I've watched about 20 so far. If you go through their video catalog, I was just looking at the 400s, like the high level stuff high level stuff. Well, I guess deep level. I don't know. Pick your. But I was looking for the meaty. Wow, here we go again. I was looking for the good stuff, from my point of view, and so I've got 7 videos of that. But I mean, I think it's we say this a lot, but this is one of those shows where you could probably be watching that stuff like for the next week or two. There's still videos I'm waiting to actually. There's talks I know happened that I'm waiting for the video to be released. So they're doing like some every day. But anyways, what did I say? I'd say the overall themes of the show was really, doubling down more on serverless, doubling down a little bit on making things easier, customer obsession with Amazon, but making things easier for the end user. I nothing really whiz-bang crazy, oh my God, from that point of view, like new products coming out. I guess one of the bigger ones for our Security Weekly fans, they've come out with this thing called Security Lake. So it's basically being able to, instead of having to build your own data lake and then put your data in there and do all the analytics, they've actually got that thing fairly turnkey. I haven't seen pricing on it, but there's going to be a price associated with it, I'm sure. But let's go through some videos. So the first one on my list, Peter DeSantis, their senior vice president of utility computing, does the night before the show. So I saw this on the schedule. It's called Monday Night Live. It's like it's live at 7 o'clock on Monday, 7 p.m. on Monday before the show starts. I'm like, who's going to get to Vegas and go and immediately go to a talk on 7 o'clock? I mean, that's when we go out for drinks or dinner or catch up.
Yeah.
And it turns out it's something that he's done every year except for the last 2, but it's quite an amazing talk. So if you're looking for stuff, I'd say definitely sort of kick off with that. He sort of goes through really starting at a high level what they're doing, and particularly for SVP, fairly impressive to see. I mean, the execs over there are known for, dive deep and all that type of thing. But his ability to go down and start talking details about what some of the stuff they're doing was really great. From there, I've got a few VPs in here that I caught their stuff. A leadership talk on compute from David Brown, who's the vice president for EC2. Again, went down. He had two talks. His other one was around networking, I believe. But this one was sort of, talking about EC2. And if you look at where these guys have come from 2006, having a single instance, and now having, I think it's close to 600 different types of EC2 instances you can get. They've got up to 800 gigabits per second on network they can do right now. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. And they're going to come out next year with 1,600 gigabits coming off of an EC2 instance. I mean, that's 1.6 terabits. That's crazy, man. And they're expecting this to be used by high-end people doing machine learning and that type of thing at large scale. High-end projects, not so much high-end people. Next, going a little bit deeper, two talks. One, best practices for advanced serverless developers. And there's links to all these, by the way, in our show notes. Julian Wood is a senior dev advocate. Good guy, solid speaker, but sort of digging down a little more into, okay, it's one thing to sort of create a function on serverless or on Lambda, but how do you actually start, as you start building out a product around there or building out like more than just a single thing, how do you think about scaling it? How do you think about the architecture of that? So it was a good talk from that point of view of like, what's going on behind the scenes? How do you worry about if as you scale, one of the things you start to have to think about is the cold start process. So if that Lambda has to restart, a Lambda is actually sitting inside of a VM. And like how do you get around that and that type of thing? And they actually came out with one of the announcements was they have the ability now to speed up that cold start. So they're able to take a Lambda, take a snapshot of that guy, figure out the base that it's sitting on. So if you have like a Node.js base or something, they're able to go, oh, that's the Node base. We'll snapshot that and keep that warm. And then we're going to snapshot your code on top of it and keep that. So if someone asks for another function, we can put those together quickly. But those two things are encrypted, so they have to be able to do that identification on an encrypted blob and then bring it together. So there's some interesting stuff going on behind the scenes there you start thinking about.
That concept is really hard.
Yeah.
It's also why when you resume your PC from sleep, that things often break.
Yes.
Right? Because it's saving the state down to the hardware. I learned working in Eclipse, down to the hardware level. So it's easy to mess up.
So some of these talks, which, and again, these are things which are interesting to me or to us, and maybe not to everyone. So hopefully they're interesting to you as well. But to key on that one and keep going.
Wait, I want to, John, I just had a quick question on the multi-tenancy, because I think as I advise companies, my scientific observation is that I think people have multi-tenancy, but they really don't. And it seems to come later. And there's a huge software development and also security aspect to that. There's I think, how do I do it? And do it with a cost in mind, right? But then there's also, how do I keep my data separate from my different tenants? Because I'm a security company and my customers are going to be very conscientious about security.
Yeah, so that's a good one.
It was probably a whole segment in and of itself.
Manny, so there was a few talks which I watched, but they didn't make it in my top 10 list, which are around resiliency at Amazon and scalability. So they talk really around how do you do things like, how do you go shard your data either from resiliency or scalability, but also there's an aspect of security in there, right? Also, as you build in that, as you architect your application to be able to do some of those things, you're adding the capability to say, hey, this is tenant A versus tenant B. So yeah, it's, and we've talked about this before, but yeah, this is some of that type of stuff that if you don't think about it up front, it requires a bit of work to go back and sort of jigger things back into place. But yeah, we were talking, you saw my reaction with Kubernetes for multi-tenancy with IBM there, 5 minutes ago. And that's something which is, I haven't been watching Kubernetes closely for a year, but I know there's folks working on that specifically, but it's still, it's
it's an option.
Yeah.
Right? From what I've heard actually recently is you can build it all in the cloud, or you can build it in Kubernetes, and then you can kind of pick and choose where you want to host it, but you can build some of that multi-tenancy into it.
There's things you can turn on, and there's work groups that are working on this. But I think it was Michael Birdsley was one of the talks I saw, and he actually had on his T-shirt. People have seen it before, where it says "Containers are not a security construct," which is
Yeah.
back to the same thing, right? And so there's ways
Right.
around this. Let me jump through one or two more. On the Lambda one, let's see, I got two or three more. Continuing on the Lambda thread and actually coming back to a little bit what you're talking about, there's a really great talk from Arachana Srikanta, principal software engineer over there, going a deep dive on both Fargate, ECS, and AppRunner, and how those things actually, what happens when you say, I want a container. So this starts coming back through some of the stuff you're thinking through, like, maybe not at the same level, but even, and these are sort of things which, the reason I'm bringing these up and they're interesting to me is like, how does Amazon run behind the scenes? It's sort of the theme behind some of these things that I'm talking through is like, you got this big, massive company. How have they got this stuff working? I mean, talk about multi-tenancy, right? So hopping forward to another one on that same topic, a day in the life of a billion requests. This is like 404. And basically with I got this guy's name on this one, but he starts off talking, and I thought this was going to be around like some large website or something. He's talking about Amazon IAM, which is now doing 500 million requests per second. This is your authentication system within there, right? So how do you actually scale that? So, I mean, talk about microservice scaling. How do you get that thing to be able to handle 500,000 requests per second? And it basically comes down to like using hashes, right? And tokens and caching. But he sort of walks through from version 1 up to where they are now. And then some of the interesting things that they've done, like I hadn't understood that. I know now you're able to turn on, you have to opt into some of the regions around the world. Never really understood why that was. But the first one they did it for was Hong Kong. Oh, now I understand why it is. So, but once they started doing that, the IAM system had to be modified so that it only redistributes your keys to the locations that you've opted into. So it gets more and more complex, even though it's a basic system. I'm going to do one more and then shut up because this is my favorite talk of all. Powering Amazon EC2, a deep dive into the AWS Nitro system. If you do nothing else, if you're nerdy, this is a great talk. Ravi Murthy, a senior principal engineer, EC2. What's Nitro? We've talked about Nitro here on the show for the last year or two, right? I've always wanted that chance to really get down and read the white papers and dig into it. And this is what my nerd self was doing last week. So Nitro started off as basically a chip for offboarding the network overhead on an EC2 instance, right? So let's have a chip do that instead of the machine, the hypervisor Zen back in the day worry about your VPCs or your tagging for your different networks, all that type of thing. Let's let a chip do it. And since then, now they're up to, I think they use 4 different Nitro cards. One, EBS is all Nitro based. Their block store system is Nitro based. The networking is obviously still Nitro based. So when I was talking about 800 gigabits or 1.6 terabits, that's based off this card that they have. The hypervisor is now almost completely controlled. Well, it's completely controlled by Nitro, along with a Nitro security chip they have. So let's go backward there. The Nitro security chip, basically, even if you have full root on that box, that chip blocks you from getting I2C access down to the underlying hardware. So like this is the level of security they're going to in some of these type of things. Then the next one on top of that with the controller. So as they moved away from Zen, as they got Nitro in over the last few years, Zen was the old Citrix-based, well, it's probably pre-Citrix, right? But Citrix virtual machine manager system. So they've now got this running on the card, which actually it basically hops on the system and tells it, hey, fire up a VM, and then goes away. So any of the management of those virtual machines happens on a hardware device, not on the machine. So whereas historically we've said if you're running virtual machines, your overhead is what, about 12%, 15% on the hardware? They're now seeing 1% overhead with versus bare metal versus nothing at all. And then he spends the next half hour sort of going through how does the system boot up a machine and actually get things going. So really great talk. But, I'm just talking, 5 minutes, and that seems like a fire hose. So you can imagine what watching it all week is like.
It is. It's wonderful. And I'm glad you saved the Nitro for last, because that was where they, as you mentioned, they updated the white paper just in mid-November describing all of those, all the different chips and the premise that says, well, how do you enforce security, like you said, when you don't have a hypervisor, when you are bare metal and you don't want the firmware updates to come from some random customers like Paul is saying like, well, I don't like this arbitrary code execution. I'm going to go play with some firmware here. But another resource I'll just add real quick too is that I always look at the cloudseclist.com. It's a great resource of weekly updates, and it has links to, for example, the most recent one to the security lake you had mentioned too, John. So these are also in addition to watching the videos, which add helpful context as you were describing. There's great resources and white papers that the cloudseclist.com points to as well.
Yeah, I hope these videos help. I'm going to go back and watch some of them now. It helps us make the decision when I'm building something in the cloud. Is it an EC2? Is it a container, or is it a Lambda? I think there's really like the major architectural questions, but security plays a big role, obviously, in those decisions, as well as your architecture, right?
From my thought process over the last 18 months, if you think an item of compute is going to run less than 15 minutes, it's a Lambda. If it's more, it's either a container or EC2. If you can get it as a container, throw it into EC2. Or sorry, if you get it as a container, throw it into ECS.
ECS. Yeah,
otherwise, it's an EC2. Yeah.
Yeah, and
good advice.
I think the only thing I add there is also thinking about, do you need state or not need state, and how are you handling that? Just because that influences the Lambda or not to Lambda discussion. And I think trying to, we got a couple more articles here to try and wrap up too. These obviously, these AWS appealed to John, so that's why he was spending his time here. And so he's going to be thinking about more AWS security, perhaps, than he even usually does. One of the other ways to get people thinking about security is have a game system. So gaming has a long history of researchers and hackers hacking on systems, bypassing DRM for that matter, as well as other things to optimize their play. And John, you have brought in an article just about FreeBSD and some vulns. I think it's safe to say coming up about FreeBSD more because of its association with gaming, perhaps, as opposed to then just a hobbyist playing around with FreeBSD on its own.
Yeah, usually they play around with the PlayStations, not so much the BSDs nowadays. Yeah, these two vulns float on my radar, CVE 2021 and a 2022, but they're both around memory sharing. They're actually both in the same source file, vmfaults.c. But at the end of the day, I can't remember if I put the link, we didn't talk about, but I can't remember if I put the link in about 2 or 3 shows back, but there was some other BSD vulnerabilities came out, Mike. And really what I'm seeing, what's sort of interesting is, as there's this drive right now to crack the PS4, to crack the PlayStations, to be able to, do your standard cracky things. I'm hand waving crazily here, but be able to, root the box and then be able to put your bootloader in there and change the games, modify things. But that drive is getting people to look at the operating system which they're running, which is FreeBSD. And so that's interesting to me, and that just from that point of view of I mentioned there's some Android things around my house somewhere I don't think about them very often. At some point, one of these days, believe it or not, Paul, Linux is going to become less popular than it is now. And then this is sort of, these things still sort of come back from the dead every now and then. I'm not quite sure when we're going to be talking about CPM, but it's interesting to see them sort of go away and then come back.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about too, that I think a lot of the research in the context of gaming and getting your custom software or bootloader on there probably has to bypass some form of secure boot. Like, it's probably not UEFI secure boot, it's some other secure boot. And typically that's just looking at the code and looking for like a hook that calls an untrusted function. Like, we've done a ton of research that in Eclipsium, and like a major class of bypassing secure boot, regardless of what kind of secure boot it is just finding a point in the code where it goes and reaches out to something that is not trusted, that is not in that chain of trust. And that's typically what most jailbreaks and everything kind of relies on.
Yeah, and I think we saw that with if I'm remembering correctly too, like a Qualcomm vuln, where that was the trusted execution environment just relied on an area that wasn't signed or that could be trivially manipulated, and things fall apart. I think you didn't mention that this is more about syscalls to continue hand waving that are dealing across trust boundaries. I had a real quick article about memory safety in Android that I mostly just wanted to highlight because it was about, they were showing how the prevalence of memory safety issues has been dropping, largely because new code is being written in memory safe languages like a Rust or Go, rather than rewriting existing code. And I think that is going to be probably what the future actually looks like, rather than the engineering investment of rewriting the Linux kernel, rewriting FreeBSD, or these really large Postgres. We'll throw that on the list. We mentioned that too. Systems from C into memory safe languages, more of just net new code is going to be the memory safe. So we'll probably see vulns for a while, but we're not going to rewrite everything now. And then, so that was more of a comment than a question. My question here is then, we have been talking about vulns and the bug bounty approaches, for example, of there was not quite a bug bounty, but the research and collaboration that Wiz was doing with IBM, the car hacking that actually got fixed very quickly with disclosure. And of course, Paul, you were just talking about disclosure. There's a great article here from Shubham Shah, who's well known within the bug bounty community, about so you want to get into bug bounties. And I thought it was really good to highlight because it doesn't just touch on like the technical aspects, but very much the personal and social aspects of bug bounty. How do you collaborate with other researchers? How do you collaborate with organizations? And I always like that idea or that angle that security testing, secure engineering, even just a little bit of callback with Aviv, designing secure products is for users. There is a user experience here that we're doing this for people and with people. We're not just piping curl into bash. So that was one of the things I just want to highlight for this article. It's a great read, especially for people who want to get into bug bounty research.
And also, Disclosure is a good band. As I was looking through this, I know quickly, John, chop. As we're looking through this, get the brain going here. If people are trying to get into this space, I mean, yeah, if you want to get in bug bounties, cool, great. But as he says, it's a super crowded space. Start off by going out to an open source project and look at their we need help here list and work on some. Yeah. I think you'll get some really great experience and benefit there by just actually working on some of the low hanging fruit and fixing some of the bugs. And then when you go to start looking at it from the other side, you'll have a bit of the red and blue in you. And I think that might actually help out.
No, indeed. Yeah, just understanding how code is put together is a great way to understand how to take it apart for sure. So, Paul, you've joined us this episode. It was fun to have you here. Any parting thoughts or any way you want to help us wrap up as we come to the close?
No, thanks for having me. My brain largely is, I have a lot of respect for people that do cloud architecture and design because it's really a lot to think about, so many different aspects of it. So I'd love to dig into that more, maybe in future episodes.
Awesome. There we go. John, we've got a topic. We'll have a cloud with Kinsella. We'll have a good segment and put you on the spot to help us out with architecture and security architecture issues in the cloud. And Paul will have to have you back to join us. I want to say thank you to Paul. Thank you to John. Thanks to all of our listeners. Please do subscribe. Hit that like button. Of course, check out our show notes. And speaking of all the nostalgia for IFS field separators and things in the past, check out When You Grow Up, Your Heart Dies by Gunship. It's a great video as well. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.